We're in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries. They're new galleries that have just opened at Westminster Abbey this month. During the course of the preparation of the galleries for display, we took the floor up and we found underneath the floor in the brick vaults about 6 foot of dust that had obviously never been cleaned since this beautiful 13th century space was first built. And as we started to clean, we found a lot of historic objects, including many, many pieces of glass. So we bagged the glass up, we sifted it through, and we decided to call in the experts at Cathedral Studios to look at it as a project, to identify what we had and clean it.
Yeah, that was an interesting day when boxes and boxes and rubble sacks full arrived in the studio. So we took all the glass out of each of the boxes, photographed them in batches after we'd cleaned them, made sure that we produced a database that would allow people to find each piece of glass again in the future. And by the end of that process, we had counted about 30,000 individual pieces of medieval glass.
Leonie came back to me and said, this is vast, this is a really big project. What do you want us to do? And gradually the idea developed when we went down with Ptolemy Dean, the surveyor of the fabric, and Richard Marks, who's a stained glass, medieval stained glass expert, to use as many of the fragments as we could in a donor window.
The outer framework of that design was a given, but quite how we would insert the fragments into that framework, that was really up to us to develop.
We wanted to display the fragments in a suitable way, and we experimented with a number of different techniques, some that we'd used before. Something that really struck us when Leonie and I were looking at the record photography that we'd produced during the cataloguing was how beautiful the fragments looked, with each fragment laid out and space between them. And this was really the effect that we wanted in the actual finished window. So we had to work out a way to achieve the same look as the record photography, but the window needed to be displayed vertically. So this is when we developed a new technique, the CASUS system, which stands for the Canterbury Suspension System. We created a sheet of glass with holes of the correct size for each of the fragments to sit within, very much like a child's toy where you have the correct shape that fits within the correct hole. Each fragment was then inserted into this glass cutout with small pieces of silicone to secure them in, and then at the front and back, thin plating glass was secured to protect the medieval glass. The added bonus of the CASUS technique is that the whole fragment is on show, even the medieval glazed edges. So that sounds rather simple, but this took months of working very closely with a local waterjet company, and it really was a steep learning curve, I think, for us and for them.
One of the most interesting tasks, perhaps, we were set was to identify what is known as star finds, pieces of glass that tell a story, a particularly important point of art historical importance, or just something that was particularly beautiful. My personal favourite is definitely a fragment of a face which is practically identical to a face in Canterbury Cathedral's west window. And to find a piece of glass that was made by the same painter for Westminster Abbey was incredibly special.
The idea that all of the glass, this 13th century glass around the borders, came from under the floors here, and the beautiful quality of the star finds, they just look magnificent. And my favourite star find is a little head of a 13th century monk that's set into the donor windows. Westminster Abbey was a monastery, and there were many, many monks here, but of course that's part of its history.
In addition to the sponsor window, we also did a second window, which used lots and lots of coloured glass in a more traditional way. So we actually used lead and glass together. And designing that was down to me, and I had no idea how to do that, because normally you start with a design and then you make the glass follow your design. In this case, that was not possible. Essentially, the design had to be a fuzzy idea of what it could look like in the end. And then I had to hand it over to Laura to make it reality.
The coloured window really was a celebration of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries. We've got the red, white and blue, and the diamond inserts running down the centre with the star finds. This window follows in a long tradition of fragment windows, but in the past, previous glaziers would have had the luxury of being able to nibble away the individual fragments of glass to ensure that they fit. But obviously now, following contemporary conservation ethics, we would never do that. We need to retain all the original material. So it really was a case of sort of sifting through thousands of coloured fragments that would fit with the next one and the one that sat next to it, and then finding another colour that worked with that. So it really, although it was following a design, it was quite a sort of organic process and really had to be led by the fragments that were available.
When we came to install the windows, that was quite an emotional moment, really, to see that ancient glass that had been made so many centuries before return to its rightful place. The windows are actually the very first thing you see when you go into the new gallery, and people stop and look at these pieces because they are so fascinating.
We would love you very much to come and look at the windows and admire the handiwork, because they're very beautiful and they're a good entry point into the new galleries, where you can also see lots of wonderful exhibits.